Hello, good morning. This is Puyan Aslani, and welcome to Woman Life Freedom Manifest, a podcast dedicated to defining and exploring the concept of modern Iranian Republic within the framework of a new social contract. This is our first English podcast, and we promise that we're going to put the Farsi transcript of this podcast on our YouTube channel. Also, we will publish the transcript of it in Farsi as well. To just give you some perspective and introduction, our mission is to analyze the principles and the foundation of a modern republic, where we try to define freedom as a non-domination. For today's show or podcast, I have the pleasure of hosting Professor Sherry Berman, a political scientist scholar from Barnard Columbia University. Professor Berman's expertise is in European democracy, and she has written 3 books. I have read the 3rd book, which basically the latest book, which is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the ancient regime to present day. The 2nd book is The Primacy of Politics, Social Democracy, and the Making of Europe's 20th Century. And the 1st book is The Social Democratic Moment. Professor Berman, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and looking forward to have a very good conversation with you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. To start the conversation, I just basically want to give you some perspective that what we are trying to do, and what basically would like to ask you a few questions about Europe and the relevance of it. We have had in Iran, obviously, since the constitutional revolution in Iran in 1906 up to now, we have had about 3, I guess, significant moments in Iran's history. First was obviously the 1906, the constitutional revolution. But then in 1920s, when we went from Ghajar dynasty to Pahlavi's dynasty, there was another turning point, because originally we were supposed to have a republic, but that's the time that Turkey basically had become a republic. That's the time that Ataturk basically established the Turkish Republic. That didn't happen in Iran, and instead we had the Pahlavi's dynasty, and in 1979 we had the Islamic Revolution, or the revolution rather, because it became Islamic a few years after that. So the intent was not basically to have an Islamic revolution, at least from my perspective. In what happened during these 2 times in 1920 and 1979, there are a few issues that are very important, I think. Obviously, first, basically, the notion of republic has been in people's mind in Iran, that what is the republic? And then in 79, the issue of democracy. And since you are an expert in Europe and you have done a massive amount of research in Europe, I would like to ask you basically what happened in Europe in terms of their democracy. And then another issue that is very important for Iranian also, which I had asked you earlier actually for this podcast, because another issue for us is important, is the fact that in Iran we have multiple ethnicities. And I had asked you to read that. I consider it's a very important article. It's called Kurdish Liberty. And that's one of the things that basically in Iran, we have different, obviously, expectations. We have the women movement, women rights. We have religious freedom. It's an issue. And then the 3rd one is basically the ethnicities. I'm not putting them in orders. I'm just saying these are the issues that we are trying to address for the future. So from that perspective, because Europe had different ethnicities, different languages, the difference were massive in Europe also. So I want to ask you this, okay, how please explain that to our audiences, that what happened in Europe historically, and then how did they basically get to this point that now they are, and from that perspective, how that basically this evolution of democracy happened in Europe. But I would like to ask you first to establish this thing that, okay, how are we going to define democracy? So let's start from that. So when we talk about democracy, what's the definition of democracy, at least in the context of our discussion? Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. So thanks. Those are three really large questions. So let me see if I can take them separately, and presumably we can then circle back for some more details and clarification. So first, the definition of democracy. So that is a very big question, as I said, and there's lots of different definitions of it. Let me start with the most simple and basic. This is not the end of a definition of democracy. It's just the beginning, so that I can first try to answer your original question about some framework for understanding the evolution of democracy in Europe, right? So if we take as necessary, but certainly not sufficient for democracy, universal suffrage, that is to say, people get to elect their leaders and governments. There are free and fair elections. That means that those elections have competition, that people are allowed to organize and speak freely around the elections, those kinds of basic things, right? So that's necessary, but certainly not sufficient for democracy. That is to say, you can't have a democracy that does not build on free and fair elections, right? So even if we are to take that very minimal definition of democracy, right, if we look at how that evolved in Europe, right, we see that this was a very, very long, very, very winding, very, very difficult, and really quite bloody evolution. So most folks who study the development of democracy in Europe start their timeline with the French Revolution, which was 1789, right? That is the first major struggle for democracy in Europe against an ancien regime that was a monarchical dictatorship, right? And anybody who knows anything about the French Revolution knows that despite its incredibly important role in European history and its incredibly, in many ways, incredibly progressive ideals that it was built around, that it is a complete and utter failure, at least from the short to medium term, right? So we get an overthrow of the monarchical dictatorship, and then within the space of a few years, we have France basically descending into what is also considered by most scholars to be the first terroristic totalitarian regime, right? So that is a regime that kills many of its own citizens. The guillotine becomes its most obvious symbol. And some years after that, of course, France settles down into another kind of dictatorship under Napoleon, which is kind of a military populist dictatorship. So in the space of 10 years between 1789 and 1799, we have the overthrow of the ancien regime. We have the first attempt at something resembling democracy. We have a totalitarian dictatorship, and then we have a military authoritarian populist one, right? So that is where the sort of history of modern democracy in Europe starts, and it's not, in many ways, a very auspicious beginning. And you can easily tell, as many people have, the story of European history from 1789 up through the 20th century is a struggle for and against the ideals of the French Revolution, and more specifically, for and against democracy. That is to say, as a struggle between democracy and its various types of opponents. And although, despite the troubles that Europe is facing today, we sort of take democracy, particularly in Western Europe, for granted, it's really only after the Second World War that democracy becomes the norm in Western Europe. Of course, that's not true in Eastern Europe, because after the Second World War, Eastern Europe ends up under another imperialist colonial regime, that is to say, as part of the Soviet Empire. So it's important to recognize that even though the starting point of modern democracy in Europe is in 1789, we do not get stable, consolidated, well-functioning democracy until after 1945. As I'm sure at least some of your listeners are aware, France is now on its fifth republic. And it is the fifth republic because it is the fifth try at finding a stable form of democratic government for France. And for those of your listeners who know even more about French history, you know that even in between those five republics, there was an incredible amount of political stability, which included significant amounts of internal violent upheaval. And so, you know, even if the birthplace of modern democracy, France in 1789, doesn't get sort of a stable democratic regime until, you know, the second half of the 20th century, you understand something about how very, very difficult it is to build stable democracy, how much back and forth there is, how many failed tries there are until countries manage to kind of, so to speak, get it right. And that is true, in fact, of most European countries, with some exceptions. The British case is often held up as the most important, although the British case is more complicated by its colonial empire than many scholars would like to believe. That is to say, its stable democratic domestic development is matched by some complicated, shall we say, international adventures that are not entirely unrelated, of course, to its domestic stability. Countries like Spain, Germany, Italy, Austria, all of these countries suffered, you know, many failed democratic experiments and much internal violence before they were able to come to a point of stable democracy in the second half of the 20th century. So what is the point of this kind of somewhat long digression? The point is to say that stable democracy is very, very rarely something that countries get on the first try. It's also something that almost always has a very conflictual and often violent backstory. And there are reasons for that. It's not just simply correlation. There's a causal relationship there. And so when a scholar like myself, who studies democracy more generally in Europe and in elsewhere, looks at countries, for instance, that are struggling to figure out how to put down the roots of liberal democratic regimes, and we can get back to the different varieties of that in a moment, it's not surprising that, again, these are very, very difficult things to do, especially that for countries that are trying for the first time to do this, for countries that are doing it at low levels of economic development, and also for countries that are that often have very long colonial histories, that is to say, that have been only relatively recently independent. And if we were, for example, to look at Europe, that would indeed include many countries in Eastern Europe, which perhaps many folks don't recognize, but really only became independent countries in the early 20th century, and then, of course, were recolonized under the Nazi and then the Soviet Empire. And so when we see a lot of the problems that countries in Eastern Europe, for example, are struggling with today, they have some important analogies with other countries that are struggling with the legacies of colonialism and the problems of building independent states and nations in a relatively short period of time.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, but just want to ask one clarification question. I mean, you started basically defining, I guess, the minimalist or a loose definition of democracy as a free and fair election. And you started with the French Revolution. So the question is, when you get to basically the Fifth Republic, and then the democracy, you said that after the Second World War. So are we still talking about the same definition, or we are saying in 1945 on, not only the definition has changed, but also these countries have become, I guess, more democratic, or however you want to define. So is it just that when we talk about the history, definition has changed too or not?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. And in fact, when I talk about these kinds of things with my students, that's precisely the way I talk about it, right? Which is that often what happens first, that is to say, when countries first try democracy, it's essentially an attempt to, put in place free and fair elections. The kinds of things that make democracy fuller or more complete, sometimes that's referred to as liberal democracy. I think in the terms that you've used, in your podcast that might be a more Republican form of democracy, that is to say, layered on to that very basic foundation of free and fair elections, there are a whole variety of other things that go along with it. Whatever it is, it's liberal rights, it's minority rights, it's rights for women, it's a whole variety of other kinds of things that we can talk about. Those kinds of things are even more difficult to develop. And so as you asked in your question, if we were to look at the types of democratic regimes that existed in Europe between the French Revolution and the 20th century, we would see that things that we could characterize as liberal democracies or Republican democracies, in your view, those come even later, right? That is really a phenomenon that is only possible in the 20th century. And if we were to look at the United States, for instance, where we are having this conversation, that would also be true, which is because obviously not only did the United States not fully incorporate all of the people who lived in this country, right? African Americans didn't have the formal right to vote. They were slaves. They were the most completely dominated of peoples up through the Civil War. And then it took another 100 years after the abolition, the formal abolition of slavery, for African Americans to become true citizens. That is to say, to even have the de facto legal rights to participate in the political process. And so the expansion, not just of democratic, but of more broadly liberal rights in the United States is also a late 20th century phenomenon. So, these different definitions of democracy are not just different definitions, they're different ways of understanding what democracy has incorporated over time. And so from that perspective, again, the struggle in older democracies like Europe or the United States really is an incredibly long-term and difficult one.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this clarification. I appreciate that. But then I guess the question that would brings us to this point that if say, okay, after the Second World War, we have a relatively newer understanding of democracy in Europe and the US. And of course, I mean, that's the time actually from another point of view, that's the time that actually Isaiah Berlin talks about liberty too, because what happened, the atrocity happened in Europe is massive. I mean, their own citizens were basically slaughtered badly. And that basically opened up a lot of issues. So from that perspective, I don't think Iran is there. I don't think this is happening in Iran in that scale. But from the perspective of claim or rights, these are the issue, I think, in Iran, because it comes to the concept of citizenship. Who do we want to call Iran? Who has right to call somebody Iranian or not Iranian? And these things are very important. So I would really like you, if you can open up this discussion about basically, I guess, somehow, what's the definition of being a citizen, right? So, and if the citizen, or rather, let's say, in Europe, even in each country, if you want to discuss, they had multiple languages that were spoken, multiple religion being practiced. And these things, I mean, one of, I guess, still, I mean, it's not relevant to our case yet still, but the issue I have with EU, generally speaking, they see themselves a Christian nation or continent rather. But in Iran, specifically, we have multiple religion. I mean, in the Middle East, the majority of Abrahamic religions are coming from that region. So it's a variety of religions being practiced and also languages and ethnicity. So how did Europe dealt with them? Have they dealt with them 100%? We still have the Basque or Catalonia issues over there. So what happened there? We could explain that a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Great. So that was your original third question, which I sort of bypassed in my digression on the development of European democracy. Before I get to that, let me just respond to one thing that you said previous to that, which is about the importance of the Second World War and folks like Isaiah Berlin and others writing after it. And the Second World War really is a critical juncture for Europe in a whole variety of ways. But the way in which it is perhaps relevant to other parts of the world is that it really took not just the incredible tragedy of the Second World War, but the even longer tragedy of the entire interwar period and before, to kind of make Europeans realize that, you know, as many complaints as they perhaps had about democracy, it was a heck of a lot better than the alternatives. It took the really incredible tragedy of that war, the Holocaust, and its aftermath to really spur in a whole variety of people, great thinkers like Isaiah Berlin, but also politicians and to a significant degree, European citizens themselves, to kind of recognize that if they did not figure out how to agree on some basic principles on regarding how to live together peacefully, that the kinds of tragedies that had plagued European history during the previous decades, and in fact, in many ways, as I've said, since 1789, would only repeat themselves. So sometimes it really takes, in a weird way, an incredible tragedy. And it would be very hard to find something more tragic than the Second World War as far as the sheer numbers of people who died and the sheer amount of destruction. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of people who died as a result of that war and its aftermath, to really get the Europeans to sit down and figure out, okay, look, we really need to have some way to put aside our differences and create a new kind of order that can guarantee both peace and prosperity. So I just, you know, that is something that is very worth stressing, that in a weird way, the most destructive event in Europeans' history was a necessary condition for the period of peace and prosperity that followed it. But not entirely unrelated, of course, is the question you asked about, you know, sort of how do you get, you know, sort of an inclusive version of citizenship? How do places deal with the fact that they do not have, you know, from whatever perspective, religious, linguistic, ethnic homogeneity? And here again, I think the European history, the history of Europe is really quite sobering. I mean, if you were to go back and look at a map of Europe in 1500, you would see literally, you know, hundreds of political units. And that would reflect the fact that there were no nations in the contemporary sense. That is to say, people's identities, you know, back before early modern Europe started, were basically local or religious. They thought of themselves as Christian, Catholic, Protestant, perhaps, depending on the time period. But they did not think of themselves as the, you know, members of the nation states, if we want to use that term, that exist in Europe today. No, very, very few people would have identified themselves, despite the fact that something like France or Spain existed at the time, although other things did not. There was no Italy, obviously, there was no Germany, there was no, you know, Hungary or anything like that. They would not have identified themselves as members of those, you know, whatever you want to call them, families or political identities. And over what happens over the course of the hundreds of years from the early modern period to the present day is not only do states consolidate, that is to say, the places that couldn't build strong modern states were basically eaten up by the ones that did. So, I mean, to put it in more comprehensible terms, strong states in Europe basically colonized other places in Europe. And then when they were done colonizing weak states in Europe, they went out and colonized the rest of the world. But in that process, what happened was all kinds of not just political units disappeared, right? So if you look again at that map in 14 or 1500, most of those places disappeared. We don't have them anymore. They no longer exist. They were absorbed by, destroyed by stronger states. But the identities that went with them, we can see some remnants of that. So if you go to a place like France, which had one of the strongest modern states, there's still some remnants of that. People who might have some identification with Burgundy or Bordeaux or some other places. But, you know, what happens in France basically is all of those local languages, of which there were many, local traditions, local cultures, those are just basically destroyed over the course of the modern period. So what you have, the process of nation building in Europe, like the process of democracy building, is really quite violent in many, many ways, directly and indirectly, in the sense that local languages, local traditions, local cultures are repressed. And also, of course, there's an immense amount of ethnic cleansing, religious cleansing that goes on in Europe, the history of the United States is an indirect reflection of that, of course, since many religious minority groups flee from Britain and elsewhere to come to the United States precisely to escape that kind of homogenating process. So what we have in Europe alongside the struggle for democracy, and it's not coincidental that those are happening and around the same time, is basically the struggle to homogenize populations, which is largely, but not entirely, completed by the second half of the 20th century. To get back to that critical juncture of the Second World War, I mean, one of the things that the Second World War does, tragically, but very effectively, is really further the homogenization of European populations. So what you have basically after the Second World War and after the unbelievable amount of ethnic cleansing that follows the Second World War. So even after the Second World War is over, we have a year or two in Europe of unbelievable ethnic cleansing that happens, of people expelled from existing states and forced to go back to whatever states they were ostensibly from, although many of these people, of course, had not lived in those places for, many, many generations. But what you have by 1947 are states in Europe whose populations for the first time really do coincide to a great degree with their ostensible nations. So that is a hugely painful and violent aspect of European history. And it's really, therefore, in many ways, only once those populations are homogenized that Europe begins layering on, as we mentioned before, a lot of those liberal rights or Republican aspects that are obviously so desirable. That is to say, thinking about more inclusive forms of citizenship once they had basically relatively homogenous populations. But there's incredible struggles over who has the right to be a citizen throughout the 19th and early 20th century, and that is accompanied by immense amounts of domestic ethnic conflicts.
Thank you. Thank you very much in terms of explaining these things. I guess, but then I would ask you, I guess, a more futuristic question in terms of like lessons learned. I mean, obviously, in Middle East or specifically in Iran, you could say that in some part that we have had certain religious people left Iran different time for basically because Iran become more and more since around 1500 more toward the Shiism. We have different like some regard Zoroastrian left Iran. I mean the Jews left after revolution. There are some serious issue with the Baha'is in Iran right now as we speak, and also the Christians of they are not that under that much of a problem, but the problem had been somehow resolved differently because of the issue of Armenia and Turkey, because we had a big population of Armenians, obviously, but then the whole Armenia later on, it was established. In fact, it's very interesting if you see that even in the United States, I have seen the Armenians from Iran that they have gone to Armenia, and then eventually some of them have come to the United States. But I guess the question I want to ask is, how can we avoid this kind of a pitfalls of this violence, this painful violence? Because I'm not denying that Iran's history hasn't been violent. I mean, the past 45 years, it has been very violent. But still, the question is, what I have, I guess, problem somehow with certain segments of diaspora or other people is the focus has been extremely to negate the Islamic Republic, which I don't think there is any justification for that. But the issue that we do not discuss enough is the whole issue of the citizenship, and then the fact that we are a very diverse country. And we don't want to be honest. And I think part of the problem, actually, I did ask you specifically for your expertise in Europe, because I feel like Iranians are under influence of European notion of democracy. without knowing the history, that they see what is happening, because I'm glad you started it, because the whole notion of democracy has become for us as a free and fair election. And then immediately you create majority and minority segments in the society. And then the next thing you know is the rights are gone, because again, the 79 revolution happened based on that. They put a referendum out there immediately after revolution, and then basically made the country Islamic Republic. And after that, they passed the constitution, and then we are standing here right now. So the question is, this happened. It's not like a myth. It happened. It's our history. So, and we know what is happening in Europe. But still, if I'm an Iranian and look at the history of Europe, what can we just look at it? Because is it the democracy that we want, just a free and fair election, or we have to address certain things before getting to the point of election, that people do not get violated and people do not get killed or tortured? Please.
Thanks. Right. So the sort of value of learning about history is that hopefully you can actually learn from it. That is to say, just because when we look back at European and American history and we see these incredible amounts of violence and this incredibly long struggle, the idea is that if we look at those, obviously every country is different, history doesn't repeat itself, but we can hopefully sort of draw some lessons, negative lessons and positive lessons, right? So if one sort of challenge is, look, how do we deal with this question of how to reconcile diverse populations with a full, that is to say, a complete conception of democracy? Well, you can learn some things, I think, from countries that have struggled with this over the course of many hundreds of years. So if we look back to that sort of critical juncture in Europe, right, we see that when European democracies, for example, were reconstructed after 1945, against the backdrop not only of failed democracies, but also this incredible communal conflict, religious conflict, ethnic conflict, whatever, right, that they did learn some lessons, right? So what are some of the lessons that they learned, right, that might be valuable? Well, one thing is that when they were reconstructing their constitutions, for example, right, they did so in ways that tried to build in frameworks and bulwarks against the kinds of conflicts that had so bedeviled them in the past. So if you look, for instance, at the post-war German constitution, obviously in many ways the most problematic case, a whole variety of basic human rights are written into that constitution, so as to, again, to put in at the very least some legal and political guardrails against the kinds of abuses of political power that existed before that. So we see, again, constitutions and legal systems that had taken in, right, after 1945, those lessons and created within their legal systems and new constitutions, again, protections for both individual liberty and minority rights. So, that gets back to our original question about how democracy becomes more complete. That is to say, more liberal or more Republican over time, right? Learning those lessons from the past. So we see, if you look at, again, a variety of European constitutions, these kind of additions to protect individual liberty and minority rights. We also see some very practical changes, right, that are still very much debated in Europe today. That is to say, more federal or confederal types of arrangements. So the type of federalism that is reconstructed in Germany after 1945 is different than the type of federalism that existed before. You have places like Spain, for instance, that after the very centralizing Franco dictatorship, when it reemerges as a democratic country after 1975, builds in not just more autonomy for Spanish regions, but over time has expanded that autonomy, protected local languages, given people at the regional level more ability to govern themselves. It's not perfect, since obviously still the Catalans are not fully satisfied, but these have been both practical and what you might call constitutional and legal changes that very much recognize the need to protect both individual liberty and minority rights. And when we look at the EU, we see something sort of that's a kind of halfway house, right? Which is, it's certainly true, as you sort of indicated at the beginning, that the sort of rhetoric about the EU being a sort of cosmopolitan institution is clearly overblown, right? The European Union is the European Union, right? It is a regional organization, not a cosmopolitan one. And it's very much been limited to countries that are seen, however defined, as being European. Obviously, the Turkish case is the most difficult one there. So, rhetoric about cosmopolitanism, sure, that is entirely overblown and somewhat self-serving. That said, if we're looking at the question of progress, right, there is something really quite dramatic there, right? France and Germany had been at each other's throats throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Europeans killed themselves in, as we've already discussed, the tens of millions in the First and Second World Wars. And so the fact that they were able to gradually, after 1945, build an arrangement that managed to secure peace, to reconcile people who had historically been enemies, and enemies in the sense of, actually engaging in violent war, and, creating a system that did not replace the nation state, but is layered something else on top of it. Is that in any way perfect? Does it make Europe a bastion of cosmopolitanism and a promoter of what you might call Republican democracy everywhere? Absolutely not. But does it represent an attempt, at the very least, to learn from the past and figure out how to solve long-standing national conflicts? I would say yes. And so, there are these kinds of different positive lessons that can be learned from European history, I think, in addition to the negative ones that, you would want to avoid.
Sure. But let me ask you another question, I guess, because before I have two more questions, but in continuation of your statement, I guess specifically about Germany, because that's another country that people take Germany very, very out of context, as you mentioned. Well, what Germany was, and let me ask you this question, I guess, this way: how did they come to the point? Because I don't think people voluntarily would come to a point to would accept other people's right. I mean, this is not necessary. It is a historical question. You picture it from the historical point of view, but in reality, the question is, because we are, I mean, again, that goes back to the view I have about human being. I consider human very violent. The question is, and everybody, the majority of people, at least, again, I'm talking about Iran, that we are struggling, obviously, to define democracy. And everybody talks about a free and fair election. And then at some point we say, okay, we have to establish rights here. If we establish the rights, that elections is going to change. Because in order to explain this a little bit broader, I mean, I don't want to go into that, I guess, rabbit hole, but just basically bring people's attention is, I mean, even now, the elections of like we have had in the US with Trump or other people, the individuals, they go into the office and they try to take actions that basically is going to violate people's right. Like, for instance, they go and take basically budget out of, let's say, in the United States from the EPA, right? So the question is, does the president or elected official has the right to go and violate a fundamental right in the principle of, okay, I'm an elected official? So how do we establish this principle of fundamental rights that the elections or elected officials, no matter in a legislators or in the executive branch, do not come and violate it? Another example of that, I guess one could argue what happened in Arab Spring in Egypt, because up to point that Mubarak basically was removed from the power. So relatively, there was a kind of a democracy. It was a free and fair election until Morsi went to the office. And the first thing that they did, they messed up with the constitution. They wanted to change it. And the people had this understanding of the the Islamic Brotherhood is going to basically make Egypt an Islamic state. And what happened, basically, the generals came back, right? So, and then you mentioned about the Germany. I guess the question is, how could human beings or citizens voluntarily sit down and establish these fundamental rights that we don't have to argue with each other about free and fair election is going to solve all problems? So go ahead.
Well, Mr. Aslani, if I had an answer to how to solve the quandary of human nature, I would probably be doing lots more important things even than teaching and writing books. But putting that little quip aside, let me try to stick to my areas of expertise and see if I can answer at least part of that question. I mean, one of the problems, or I think the challenges that you're pointing out, is that, you know, we can set up great rules, you know, a constitution, a sort of Republican democratic system. But if people's nature, or let me put it this way, if people's commitment to republicanism or liberal democracy is not strong, while the rules matter, institutions matter, they can constrain human behavior, they cannot alone ensure liberal or democratic outcomes. So that is certainly true, right? And so, you know, with the Arab Spring, just to sort of get back to that very brief example, I mean, you know, that was in many ways a first try at democracy in many of those countries. And so the fact that there were all of these tensions does not surprise me. It saddens me, but it doesn't surprise me. And what you had there obviously was a tension between, you know, people were so fearful that Morsi was going to turn, you know, Egypt into some kind of religious regime that they were willing to push back against the democratic rules of the game and, you know, embrace, or at least indirectly acquiesce in, a military dictatorship that is now even more repressive than the Mubarak regime was, right? But that is the story essentially of what happens during the French Revolution, right? The fear of radicalism encourages, you know, members of the middle class, or it's an awkward term for the French Revolution, and moderates and conservatives to throw their arms around, you know, a sort of dictatorship. But that putting that question aside, right? What you're asking is, look, how do we build in people a respect for, or even a reverence for, the importance of individual liberty and minority rights, separate from just kind of, you know, writing a smart constitution and building the rule of law and all those kinds of things. And I would say that, look, these are very interactive processes, right? So, you know, you can write better or worse constitutions. You can put in place better or worse institutions. That is to say, institutions that are more likely to encourage inclusive participation, to discourage corruption. But at the same time, right, there has to be processes in addition to those institutions and those legal and constitutional frameworks that help to educate people about the importance of respecting, whatever you want to call it, human rights, individual liberty, and minority rights. And that is a role for education. That is a role for societal conversations, talking, for instance, perhaps about what our new social contract would be. These things have to work together, right? If people's values and norms don't change along with changes in things like constitutions and, you know, the type of way in which leaders and governments are chosen, if there is a mismatch between the development of those things, something is not going to work well. And I think, again, if you look back at the history of places like the United States or Western Europe, you can very much see the pull and push between those kinds of things, right? Like, so clearly in the United States at this point, we have a lot of dysfunctional institutions and a lot of dysfunctional rules. Part of that is a consequence of us having written a constitution at a time that is very different than the time today, but part of that is also a result of our neglecting, right, how to deal better with our societal divides and political polarization. We relied on assuming that our existing institutions were going to solve our political problems. They clearly have not. And, you know, we need to think about how we as a society are going to recommit ourselves to democratic and liberal values, because we're not going to be saved simply by the fact that we have, as you said, sort of rules for elections and a constitution. So both of those things have to happen together to get a stable, well-functioning, whatever you want to call it, liberal, democratic, or Republican regime that people are committed to and willing to prioritize over other kinds of things.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you said it beautifully, actually. That's, at least from my perspective, I'm trying to push to at least to have the dialogue about those values and norms, and strongly believe that, yes, the Constitution, which is basically a legal procedural stuff, is not going to solve the problem because people start manipulating it for different reasons. So in order to develop those values and norms from that perspective, that basically, I guess, would become the answer to, I guess, the first question or discussion we had about the definition of democracy. I mean, because I strongly believe that in Iran, we have not had that discussion in terms of these values and norms, and then the majority of time, obviously, it has been an absolute monarchy, and then now we have basically a system that basically gets its legitimacy from God with a certain interpretation of it. So it's not even open to interpretation of a lot of people, just a very specific interpretation of it. So, I mean, if I want to basically ask the last question in terms of sustaining such a democracy, and then the role of people in terms of basically defining values and norms and discussing it. I mean, this doesn't have anything to do necessarily with your expertise, but again, coming from knowing about Europe, how could we basically ignite such a dialogue within Iranians? How could we basically say, in order to go through the transition or the evil of the Islamic Republic, we must address these norms and values among themselves first, to understand what we want in the future to have, because this notion of transition in Iran, from going from Islamic Republic or transforming it, to what has created a lot of divisions among Iranians. And I think until we do not establish these values and norms and have a mutual understanding at the big level that what we want would facilitate this transition for us much easier. And I guess the last part that you would, I guess, I don't know, I'd like to hear your point of view. Also, the international communities to see that what is happening in Iran from the perspective of the people of Iran, what Iranians want. And because I would say, you would agree with me, these values and norms are going to be universal values and norms. So it's going to be common among all humans. So when we talk about the minorities, languages, religion, etc., etc. So that would be, I guess, my last question for you. If you could basically have your personal thoughts on that. And again, once again, I really appreciate the time and the effort you basically spend on this podcast. Please.
So great. That's a great place to kind of think about what the sort of implications of all of this sort of historical stuff are. I mean, so let me just start with one last historical point, which is that, as a scholar a student of the history of democracy, not just in Europe and elsewhere, it's very important to recognize that it's much easier to get agreement on why you don't like an old regime than it is to get agreement on what should be the foundations of a new one, right? And that's another way of just saying that's why so many democratic experiments, for example, in European history failed, right? Because you got massive discontent with some kind of old regime. And then as soon as that old regime falls or weakens, you begin to get lots of conflict within the opposition about what the nature of the new regime would be, which is a way to lead into the point that you are making, which is, look, it is very important for us, for any society that is thinking about what its next political stage will be, to think very carefully, not just about what you don't like about the old regime and why you want to get rid of it, but what it is that you want to build afterwards. Because once that transition happens, and this is kind of another way of looking at what happened in a place like Egypt, right? Once that transition happens, all of these challenges begin to hit not just whoever becomes the leader or the new government, but the citizens themselves. And it's very easy to be overwhelmed by those challenges if you don't have some basic agreement about what it is that your priorities are and what you as a society stand for. And so what does that mean practically, right? Rather than just in this kind of abstract way, it means that it is very important to start having conversations about what it is that you want to achieve and what kinds of compromises we don't have a good word for this in English, people as citizens, right, are willing to make before you're confronted with this rush of challenges that happens when an old regime sort of disappears, right? And we have seen some examples of this, not perfect, but examples of this before. If you look at something like the Spanish transition, again, that happens after Franco dies, you have these collections of elites, representatives of the right and the left, of labor and business, who get together before the Constitution is actually proposed to kind of talk about, okay, look, we had this terrible civil war in the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Spaniards lose their lives. We do not want that to happen again. What are the things that we need to agree on before the full transition happens, right? That was not a perfect process, but it was a learning from the past process, a recognition that without some kind of conversations or even agreements before that, that the transition could very easily go awry. So what does that mean? It means that you want to have as many of these conversations as possible in advance of losing an old or the collapse of an old regime. It means you want to be as inclusive as possible, trying to get as many people who are, at least in the abstract, committed to a democratic regime to have these conversations and to begin to recognize that when you live in a diverse society, compromises need to be made, dialogue needs to happen, and you have to think very carefully about what your fundamental values are and then be willing to make trade-offs and bargains on almost everything else. But having those kinds of conversations before rather than after is very important. And if a regime falls and there's a new set of rules to be made, to try to make the conversations about what those rules would be, constitutions, electoral rules, what do you want to do about federalism versus confederalism, or all of those kinds of things, to be as inclusive as possible and to try to educate the population as much as possible before setting these rules in place means not only that people will hopefully understand the logic of these rules better, but will have a sense of buy-in to them. They will understand that, they were part of that conversation. And even if they didn't get everything that they wanted, because you never can get everything that you want unless everybody thinks the same, and that doesn't happen in the real world, but that, you got enough of what you needed and your needs and your fears or concerns were at least listened to, so that you are willing to, again, give this new set of rules, this new regime, your commitment, and behave within those new rules accordingly.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Berman. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Very welcome.